Hi, it's Jacob. In case you haven't heard, I just launched a brand new podcast with my wife, Blake, which is all about how to be your own boss. It's called the BYOB Podcast. Together, we have over 2 decades of entrepreneurial experience, and we are both 7-figure entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, parents, and partners in everything we do. If you want to learn how to be your own boss, check it out at byobpodcast.com or take our quiz to see if you have what it takes to be an entrepreneur at beyourownbossquiz.com. Make sure to follow me on Spotify or subscribe to the show on your favorite platform. You can do so easily by going to futureofworkpodcast.com. And lastly, please do me a favor, rate the podcast on Apple Podcasts or whatever your preferred platform is. It really helps spread the word about the show, and I personally appreciate it.
You might meet with somebody, and for you, that meeting, may be the last thing that's on your mind, but it may be the most important meeting of the day for that other person. And so kind of, taking a deep breath and being the person you want to be in that moment is, I think, really important. And it's something particularly in this pandemic environment. You might be running 100 miles an hour and really thinking about a lot of things, but if you can just take a deep breath and reframe yourself for what you're about to go into it, I think that's really important.
That's Melissa Smith, CEO of WEX Inc., a provider of payment processing and information management services in the US, Canada, South America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. They have around 5,000 employees and $1.7 billion in revenue. Melissa has received several awards during the course of her career, including being recognized as one of the top women to watch and one of the most innovative women in payments. In today's episode, Melissa shares some of the lessons she's learned in business and in life. She talks about her experience as a female leader, how leadership has changed due to COVID, how she defines personal success, how she deals with internal and external doubt, and much more.
You have the power to impact the way others think and feel by your own actions. And so think that sometimes when you're younger, or at least when I was, I would undervalue the impact of my words or my actions. And, as I've gotten older, and you almost take away some of your power when you do that. When you get older, you realize that everything you do affects the people around you, like it or not. And so you have to be, you have to just be thoughtful about that.
The world is changing quickly. What do you need to know and do in order to be successful now and in the future? From leadership to the future of work to employee experience, this show will give you the insights and the tools you need to succeed and thrive professionally and personally. Make sure to follow me on Spotify or subscribe to the show on your favorite platform. You can do so easily by going to futureofworkpodcast.com. Also, please rate the podcast on Apple Podcasts or whatever your preferred platform is. It really helps spread the word about the show, and I personally appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Future of Work. I am your host, Jacob Morgan, and today my guest is Melissa Smith, the CEO of WEX Inc. Melissa, thank you for joining me.
It's great to be here, Jacob.
So lots of things that I want to talk to you about today, but before we jump into any of that, maybe you could share a little bit of background information just about you, how you grew up, how you were raised. I actually saw a talk that you gave, and you said that you got a motto of "Why not," which came from your mom, which I thought was a great story.
Yeah, my mom had a huge influence and still does in my life, and so I think in part my parents divorced when I was 2, so I was really young, and that divorce really impacted how my mom raised both myself and my 2 sisters. And she married this wonderful man, so I was really lucky. I had a fantastic stepfather growing up. But she made it pretty clear from the beginning that she wanted to make sure that each of us were highly independent. And, that meant both that we had our own path in life, but also that we were economically independent. And I think that was in part because she had a master's in mathematics. She was able to take care of herself when she had to, and she had 3 little kids. And she really pushed us. We grew up in a rural area. There was only about 400 people in my hometown.
What was
And
the
she
hometown?
just, yeah. So I grew up in northern Maine. So I grew up in this place it was a working potato farm. So my mom had decided to move us back to where her parents were because they were aging. And so I grew up in this working potato farm in northern Maine. And
Wow.
it was great. Like one of the things that I got from growing up there was this fierce attachment to the outdoors. And and where I grew up was a very poor area, and I think that was also really good for me foundationally to understand, that kind of the difference between want and need. But this idea of why not that you talked about was mom always in the background with us. When we would come home and talk about not being able to do something, she would push and say, essentially, why not? And I think that what I took away from that is a lot of things you think you can't do or things that you tell yourself you can't do. It's not that you're not capable of it. You kind of put that burden on yourself. And she was there pushing us, reminding us that we could. And I have a sister who's a nurse, and I have a sister who's a trained equine surgeon, and I think that was all in part because our mother, was there making sure that we pushed ourselves.
How did you go from a small town of 400 people on a potato farm to being the CEO of a company like Wex Inc?
Yeah, from there to here. It, I think that it was fortuitous when I went to college. I said that my first economics lesson was my mom again reminding me that that going to college had to actually pay for itself. And so when I went to college, I went in with a practical area of interest. I wanted to be in business, but I didn't really know and really hadn't been exposed to other people to know what the options were. But I had an accounting professor who used to write on my tests, and I would get it back, and it would have this little note on it saying that I should consider public accounting as my career. And I thought it seemed like the most boring thing in the world. But he, took an interest in me and talked to me about it, and that's ultimately what I chose to do. And I went to work for Ernst and Young, and that was, such a great foundation because you learned very quickly how to work with other people and how to manage a budget, and you were externally facing, working with clients, immediately, and you started supervising other people immediately. So it was really good beginning. And then I had met someone one night who worked at then, it was called Right Express then, and he called me the next day and had said, would you come and interview for a job opening that I have? And had said that, I was not really that interested, but he talked me into coming in and meeting with the then CEO, a man named Paul Walsh. And Paul, over a period of time, really talked me into what there was here. And a lot of what he said, I'd still say to people that, Wex is the type of place where an individual gets to make an impact, that the growth of the company creates opportunity for you, and that you're going to be rewarded for that. And, I really bought into that. But again, it was like over months, and it was best move I ever made. I've done 9 different things in the period of time that I've worked here, and I've been the CEO for coming up on 7 years now.
For people who are not familiar with Wex Inc., can you give a little background information about the company and also how big are you guys? How many employees work there?
Yeah, sure. So we're a payments company, and we work really exclusively with businesses. And so most people have never heard of us, but what we end up doing is integrating into the operations of other companies that, and in a way that makes their ability to grow or their ability to control costs easier. And some of the examples of that would be if you happen to have a fleet of vehicles, we have an ability to control costs around that vehicle so that when people are buying fuel or fuel related services, we can monitor that to make sure that they're really paying for the fuel for that particular vehicle, that they're buying the right product, that they're doing it in the right geography. And we do that to extend that into corporate payments, where if a business is making payments on for their company, we can do that electronically, and all the way to if you have a healthcare account, like an HSA account or an FSA account, where the technology that's often in the background of that, and in that case, we're making sure that people are buying things that are allowed under tax rules. And so, what we do, I know, varies, but the customer for us is a business, and some of those businesses are really large, like Shell and ExxonMobil, or Expedia or Bank of America, and sometimes that business is the small landscaper that is just right down the road from you.
And how many employees work at WEX Inc.?
So we have just under 5,000 employees globally. And last year, in 2019, we had 1.7 billion in revenue.
Wow. It's a tiny company, huh?
It's funny, when we went public in 2005, we had about 240 million in revenue. So like I kind of measure us in sizes, because, when I first started, we were 50 million in revenue. And so the company has really, changed a lot, and yet in some very fundamental ways, we're, very much the same, but, and other ways, much more global, a lot more complexity to what we do. The technology has changed, but the kind of the heart and soul of the company is very much the same.
One of the things that I want to ask you about is being a female CEO, because I have a lot of listeners on the show who always say, Jacob, you need more female CEOs. And I say, I try to get as many female CEOs as I can, but I think on the Fortune 500, and I talked about this in a previous episode, I think it's like less than 8% of Fortune 500 CEOs are female. So there are not that many female CEOs out there. And I was actually watching a talk that you gave at TEDx in San Diego. And I won't share the story, but you actually had a very interesting story of meeting with a portfolio manager there. So I was hoping you could share that story. And also, what has it been like for you being a female CEO?
It's interesting, because I don't think of myself as a female CEO, which was probably part of the part of the whole thing. But I do think of myself as clearly when I walk into a room, I get a reaction. And I think that the story that you're talking about, when we first became public in 2005, I was a pretty young CFO, and I would walk into the room with portfolio managers or potential investors, and who hadn't met me before, and I would get a kind of a visual reaction of surprise, and it bothered me initially, and then I realized I had to reframe it as it makes me stand out and be memorable, and then there's a benefit in that, and but I always had this kind of lingering suspicion that what was happening in the background. And then one day, the head of investor relations and I were on a phone call, and we'd met with the person that we normally meet with one of our investors, and then there was a portfolio manager there who hadn't met me before, and as we hang up the phone, they thought that they had hung up on their side, but they hadn't. And so what I heard was the portfolio manager saying to our contact, the CFO is a chick. And then our head of investor relations jumped up, and he was trying to disconnect the phone. And I said, no, I want to hear this. And I really wanted to understand what they said. And they said, the person we worked with said, yes, but she's a geek chick. And I thought, wow, it couldn't, it was one of those pause of breath moments. And then they just went on, and they talked about the answers to the questions that they had. And I kind of rationalized geek chick, and it's probably a backhanded compliment, and what I took away from that was that people recognized the fact I was different, to the point that they stopped, acknowledged it, spoke about it, but then they really cared about the content of what I had to say. And I think that that's true, is that people recognize the fact that you're different. I'm aware of that. I've gotten less aware of it, honestly, over time. I've just gotten used to that being part of the world that I live in. But But people fundamentally, particularly in a public company environment, they care about performance and
Yeah.
they care about what you bring to the table. And that ultimately is what it's going to fall back on.
It's interesting that you say you don't think of yourself as a female CEO, because I've talked to a couple CEOs over the years on this show, and a lot of them very much tell me the same thing. But at the same time, the experiences that you have are quite different. Like a portfolio manager saying, "Hey, the CFO is a chick," or Barbara Humpton, the CEO of Siemens in the United States, was telling me that as she was becoming more senior in her career, she would have a lot of other executives tell her that she had to pick between either being successful or raising a family, that she couldn't have both. So I'm wondering, do you or have you experienced any of those types of things yourself? Do you feel like you've had to work harder, make tougher decisions, put yourself out there even more?
It is different. Yeah, I clearly it's different. I think the important part though is those things happen. Um, and if you allow that to be kind of the central part of your thinking, so if I start with the fact that it's unfair, then you're almost putting your own baggage on top of what's already going to be a little bit more difficult. And so I think of that as I would rather not have that in the back of my mind, not have your own mind questioning what you're capable of, on top of what's going to be other people who do perceive that, they just can't relate or understand sometimes of how you're capable of doing what you're doing. And but that's kind of that's not for me to own. I think that's for me to a certain extent put blinders on and focus on what needs to get done.
Yeah, I love that you said don't go into things thinking that it's unfair. Because I was actually just going to ask you if you have any advice out there specifically for female aspiring leaders. And it sounds like that could be a fantastic piece of advice: is don't go into anything thinking it's already unfair for you, and then putting your baggage on top of that.
Yeah, I talk a lot about the voice in the back of your head. I think women have, that sounds a little funny, but I think women have inherently a little bit more self-doubt. And a part of being able to be successful is to quell that voice in your head that is questioning if you're good enough, if you're capable or enough. And in part is because you'll get legitimate voices that are going to come at you that are going to ask those same questions. And so if you already start with that plus your own doubts, I think it just can become overwhelming. And so I think that that's really important. I also think for women that sometimes you can project forward, and I don't know if men do this too, but I think that women project forward what their life is going to be like. And it doesn't always just follow a normal pretty pattern. And, as an example, that I had children in my 40s. And so if I had made choices with the way that I thought my life was going to go, in which case I would have had children younger than that, I might have made different career choices. But, the idea that I didn't alter my path with what might happen, I think was also really important. And because you took it as it came, with that, with the idea that, life is full of surprises. Things that are going to go differently than you expect them to go. And so I think being really open, but also don't try to pre-plan too much. I think that's really important for women.
You mentioned doubt. And so, kind of two parts to this one. One is, have you ever experienced, or do you still experience, that self-doubt, the imposter syndrome? And what do you do when that happens? And also, what happens when other people doubt you? And they say, oh, Melissa, you can't do that, or you're not good enough, or there's no way you're going to succeed at this. How do you deal with both the internal doubt and the external doubt when they come up?
The internal doubt, it's really about toning that down, because I think that it's always going to be there. It's always going to be in the background, and you just have to learn to kind of switch that voice off. But at the same time, you have to really pay attention to the other voices. And so when there's a fine line of being really thoughtful of seeking out feedback, accepting feedback as a gift, but also ignoring, the naysayers. And that's a really fine line. And so when someone says I can't do something, that's almost like a challenge, right? So that's in a way that's almost easy. But but if someone's has a perception of your capability of doing something, then there's a seed of that I always want to lead into to understand, why is that coming at me that way, and is there something that I need to adjust in the way that I'm operating, or is it just someone else's perspective and it really isn't, it's not a pattern, or it's not particularly relevant. So I don't think of it as a one blanket thing. I think your own voice, I have a blanket statement of you got to just tone it down. Other voices, you just have to sift through it and figure out, which ones are legit and perception does matter and that you're addressing, and then which ones are just, people that are going to be naysayers, and you just have to, move on and prove them wrong.
Do you ever get your fair share of, I guess you can call them naysayers. I like to think of them as trolls. Over your career, have you ever had people who are just, they just don't want to see you succeed for whatever reason? They just want to see you fail. Have you ever had anybody like that?
I haven't had a lot of that. I've had, I've definitely had people, with perceptions of that you can't do multiple things at once. So this idea, in particular of having a family and having a career. I think that's evolved some, but it is still, when I get introduced, I often get introduced, and part of my bio is the fact that I'm the mother of 3 children, which is, it's just not, the guy who runs our PR is always a little indignant about that, because he's like, he's worked with men his whole life, and he's like, they've never introduced them as a father,
Yeah.
And so, so I think that there's a little bit of a bias that's embedded in that, but I don't think of that as a troll. I think that what I felt when I first announced that I was going to have my first child, I was very aware at the time, because all the research we had to do of how few public company CEOs that had children, females, and so that became a little bit more of a burning platform that I had to prove that you could. So I think I felt an extra amount of responsibility, particularly in those first few years as a result of it. But I don't think I would almost say the opposite. When we announced that I was going to have a child, the amount of goodwill and support that flooded my way was just, it was overwhelming and remarkable. And it wasn't all just other women. It was the thing that stood out for me were the number of voices I had from men who had daughters. And, I remember actually when I had presented it at a customer event, and I was, it was pretty far along in my first pregnancy. And as I got off the stage, one of our customers came over and was talking to me, and he said, I think this is so great and so important. And he, went on to talk about how that was going to be important to the future for his daughter. And, it's something that I had never thought about. But I, in my experience, have certainly had people who question that you can do multiple things, but I've actually felt almost the opposite, of more support than I would say trolls.
Great. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about the impact that COVID has had on your organization. So do you remember where or what you were doing when you first got the news that you would have to shut down and move towards a virtual work environment? Like, what was going through your mind? What were you thinking when you first heard about that?
Yeah, so WEX is a growth company. In 2019, we made the list of top 100 growth companies by Fortune magazine. So it was, that's kind of how we're wired. But that also means we're nimble. So it's been a very different time than the history of the company. And I think that we're going to be a better company as a result of that. But, we were certainly impacted because some of our customers, if you think about kind of what our customers are, a cross-section globally of businesses. And so, some of those businesses been hit disproportionately. So those that are travel related, were certainly hit more than those that are like in our healthcare part of our business. And so your question about when I hear, we spent a lot of time in the very beginning of this. We were really focused on the safety of our employees and the safety of our customers. And so we spent a lot of time in the very beginning trying to decide which offices we should shut down when. And we had this very sophisticated grid around that. And then I just decided that we were going to shut it all down. And so we were one of the first companies to move people to work remotely. And it was actually a relief, I think, for all our employees just to have the decision be made, have it not be really complicated. We had worked really hard on our technology, which has always been a strength of ours, but we really have built up our technology even more so over the last several years. And so it really, from a tech perspective, was a pretty simple process to move everybody home. And so we did that, and we've kept people home. So we have maybe 50-ish people of our 5,000 that go into offices. So some of our offices, we allow people to go in on a voluntary basis with lots of restrictions in place. But most of our employees, and we keep pretty good tabs. We stay connected. Still would prefer to work from home until there's a vaccine in place. And so I think you'd expect us to be working from home for quite a long time.
Has there been any negative impact on that, or has the transition to being virtual been? I mean, it sounds like, at least from a tech perspective, it's been pretty seamless. But what about from some of the other perspectives? Communicating, collaborating, leading teams. Have you guys had to adapt in that regard?
It's been interesting. And I'll give you kind of the puts and takes from our perspective. I think that some of the pluses for me, we are a very decentralized organization to start with. So we have people literally all over the world. And the people that were not working in some of our major hubs actually feel more connected because the communication is much more frequent and informal. And so it just has allowed people to stay really connected. And so there's an advantage of that. The people who've worked in some of our major hubs, I think, have struggled a little bit more with not seeing their teammates on a day-to-day basis. It hasn't really impacted overall productivity. I think that there were waves of this, though. In the very beginning, people were so excited, that everything was working, and the ease by which we went into a remote mode. And I think that over time, we've had to deal with, fatigue of just sitting and staring at a computer screen, and making sure that we think about things in not having it stay the same every day. And it's kind of one of the great things about the culture of the company is that it's fun. And, part of that fun is the connectedness to other people. And so people have just been fantastic. They have virtual coffee breaks or happy hours. I just had a meeting this week. Everyone had lunch delivered at the same time. And so I think that people are finding ways of staying connected. The overtime parts that we do think about are making sure that we stay innovative. And I think that for us, we're going to see is that's when we'll pull people in, periodically when we think that you need to get people together in order to innovate. So far, we've been able to use a lot of the technology tools to do it, and it's been okay. But I think that ideal is when you have people, together when they're working on something that is new or different or innovative, and that will evolve. And we had already changed a lot of our workspace anyway to be collaborative, so it's actually set up in a way that is pretty easy to bring people back in with that in mind.
Do you think offices are going to disappear and we're all going to work from home forever, or do you see a lot of value to the in-person working together aspect?
I do not think offices will disappear. I think that they will become different. And one of the things that's been pretty steadfast, and at least with our survey and our employees, is that the majority of our employees want some combination of both in their future. They want the flexibility that they've had from being able to stay home and just their perception is that just enabled them to do things that they couldn't do before, and in part because they're not commuting. Although it's not like we have huge commute times in Maine, but I think that it's just given them a newfound sense of flexibility, even beyond what I would have described as a flexible work environment to start with. And so they want to keep a piece of that, but they also want the connectedness. It's part of our cultural values at WEX are around community and relationships, and it's part of who we are. It's a very relationship-oriented business, and I think that that's going to continue to become one of the the draws for people. And so we'll do some of each. So we'll have people come in and they work collaboratively, and then I expect that they're going to also work from home some, and I think that's great. It kind of plays off some of our strengths. We're already biased towards flexibility. We're already biased towards people don't have to work in one location. They can be spread out. And I think what we're finding is we can really lean into that, and we can recruit people differently, and we can set up our space differently. So we'll probably have less space per person than we did before. We'll set it up a little differently, but we were already leaning that way.
What about as far as leadership goes? Because obviously, when you're leading, motivating, engaging, inspiring people in person, it's one thing, but doing it behind a screen, a microphone can be different. Have you guys experienced, or you personally, have you noticed any challenges, or have you had to adapt your leadership style in a virtual world?
I think that connecting with people is important, and in person is obviously it's ideal. It's part of why I travel all over the place is in a normal environment is to be able to connect with people. But I still find some of the things that I would have done before translate through now. The idea of sending handwritten notes is something that I've always done. It's something that continues to be important to people. Recognizing what they do in a short period of time from when it happened continues to be important. And so that might be a phone call now as opposed to me dropping by into their office. So I think that it's probably not as good as being in person, but the idea of staying connected and recognizing what people do at a personal level, I think that has continued and will probably always continue.
Can you share a little bit about the handwritten notes? What are those for?
Those are just call outs, thank yous generally, recognizing something that people have done. And it may be as simple as we do a charity triathlon every year. It's something that I participate in, and I'd like to write notes to the people who participate from WEX. It's something we sponsor. It's a big thing in the community, and it's something that they don't have to do, and they choose to do outside of their normal work world. And for most people, it's putting them outside of their comfort zone to do that. So that it might be that. It might be we just did a big tech implementation, and I want to make sure that I'm saying thank you. I do it when people get promoted. Mm-hmm. So if someone is getting promoted into a VP role, I will send them a handwritten note and a gift, and recognizing the fact that it's a big step in people's career.
I love that you talk about recognition, because one of the things that I think leaders could do a much better job of is recognizing their people, even if it's something small. So I love the handwritten notes, and I'm curious, do you have any other examples or stories you can share of what do you typically do to recognize people? Because it sounds like they can be simple acts, but they have a huge impact on your people.
Well, it's not one thing. I think of that as like it's a series of many things that happen. Giving people stock grants that are unexpected is something that is important to me. It's for the above and beyond. It's tying people into our investors, but also recognizing what they do. It gives them the ability to create wealth, and so that's it's a place that I'll go also. So they're not always little things. Sometimes they're much bigger things, but I think all of them have a place, and really what you want people to know is that their work is recognized and valued, and and it actually goes both ways. During this pandemic period of time, I have had there's been one employee that every month sends me a handwritten note, and I like it's awesome. I got a bunch in the very beginning, but I have one person who takes the time to send me a note every month to just remind me how important that leadership is during the pandemic. Yeah. And it also reinforces the reverse for me that it's actually nice when I open it up.
What are your thoughts on knowing your people as individuals, as human beings, and not just as workers? Like, do you take time to get to know the people who work for WEX Inc. outside of just their role?
I don't think that people can separate I think of it as your whole life, your personal life and your professional life, and the way that we live and work, they bleed together. And so there's a balance of being respectful of people's, privacy, but also getting to know them is really important. And, it's how you form relationships. And I would go beyond saying that for employees. I would say that's true for customers. We have, lots and lots of customers who've gone back many, many years. And so there's deep relationships that sit there. You can go across any of the stakeholder set. And I think knowing people and what's important to them is really important. And when you're doing career pathing or you're talking about someone about their life or what they want to do next, really understanding what's important to them it isn't just about their professional life. It's about their whole life.
So you take the time to, like you said, know about their whole life, not just their professional life.
Yeah, to the extent you can, and to the extent that the person wants you to. You have to be respectful of people's privacy too. Yeah. Like some people are very open about their lives and other people aren't, and that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, especially now with COVID, right? We see so many people who are having meetings, and they're from their bedrooms, their kitchens, their living rooms. So you're really getting an inside glimpse into a lot of how people live, and I mean, I think now it's so important to really understand the people you work with and for, of course, if they're open to sharing that with you.
Yeah, I think it has been one of the upsides. Even at, our board meetings, it's the same thing. We're conducting a board meeting and everybody's in their house, and so you get to see people in a totally different way than you did before. And actually, in many ways, I think that has drawn people closer together. I would say that's been true with our board. Is that it's been a mechanism. The board was already very high functioning, but it has drawn people, I think, closer together. Because of the environment that we're in.
I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk a bit more about you. What does a typical day look like for you? And I know there's the typical day before COVID and typical day post COVID. Maybe we can start with before COVID. What was your day typically structured? And maybe you can start even with when you wake up in the morning to when your day actually ends.
Well, I'm a big runner, and I run first thing in the morning, so I don't know that has changed, but my gear changes depending on the time of year it is. But so I find running is a great way of clearing my mind. And the thing that is different, the biggest thing that's different pre-COVID and post-COVID is, pre-COVID I was on lots and lots of airplanes, and so that's probably the biggest difference. Is now I'm on lots of videos, but the work itself, I try to spend as much time as I can with customers, with investors, with all of our stakeholders, our partners, and with the board, and also with our employees. It's balancing the needs of all the different stakeholders, and so I don't feel like what I do has changed much. The delivery of how I do is very different than being in person and traveling all over the place to do that. Things end up getting sequenced a little bit differently because you're kind of slotting yourself into these calls that you're that we're on. But the work itself, I think the only other thing I'd add is that there's been a whole category of work that came because of the pandemic that isn't normal for us. So I think people, including myself, have worked really hard in this period of time, doing things that are on top of spending time with customers and prospects and all of that. It's also thinking about all the things that could happen in the future, and making sure the business is ready for that.
So up early in the morning, like you said, getting the run in, and then it sounds like most of the time is spent with people, meetings with different customers, employees, investors, and then when your day ends, do you shut off completely, or do you continuously work up until bedtime?
That's funny. The Well, remember, I have three kids. I have a 6-year-old and 3-year-old twins. And so now that I'm home, I do try to squeeze in whenever I can dinner with my children. And then I once they go down for bed at night, which is actually pretty early, then I'm typically working again after that.
Got it. So next question, also a little bit about you, is how would you explain or describe your leadership style?
I think about leadership. I think life's all about the people, and I'm a very relationship heavy leader. I like to bring people in that have very diverse perspectives, and you can see that across the executive leadership team. You've got lots of people born outside of the United States, lots of women, and men, and people who've only worked in small companies and people who've only worked in big companies, and you kind of put them all together. And I like that because I like the idea that that people are going to come at each of the decisions with a different background, and I think you end up with a better result, because of that. So, I think of that as you kind of like put an idea in a shaker, and you get lots of feedback around that, and I think you get a better result. And that comes though from knowing how to balance the conflict that those diverse perspectives are going to bring, and be comfortable with the fact that creates a little tension in the system, but you're going to end up with a better result from it.
Yeah, no, I think
So
that
when I think of
diversity is
leadership,
huge.
it's and that's a big part of it is looking for people who don't just say yes to you, that actually have a different perspective, and then being willing to listen.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. When you look at what's going on in the world in general, are there some big business trends that you are paying attention to as you look at the future of your business?
Well, I don't think I would tell you anything that's not obvious by now. You can see it in our customer base. There's winners and losers that come out of what's happening right now, and there's a lot of divergence. And anything digital. Luckily, everything we do is digital. But anything in the digital space is just been outperforming, and so that's been a place that we had, it's really all our products are digitally enabled, but we've been really pushing any of that work even faster forward. And that's I'd say that's the biggest difference we see within our customer base, and then also just understanding as this evolves, what trends do we want to play into on a longer term basis. The healthcare part of our business has been, really, really, it's just grown right through this. And I think that's been another place that if we look at trends, spending patterns have changed. And, there are places where, that there's a benefit to that. And there are places where, in those places are places that we're emphasizing. I guess it's probably the simple way of saying it.
What about anything in terms of like people and workforce? Are you finding that your employees are asking about different things? They care about different things? And of course, you have different generations in the workforce. Are you seeing changes at all in what people care about and value?
I think that the idea of flexibility, if I had one big bubble over my head with our employees, it's that word flexibility. And it's and which again is which it's not that is new, but it has been supercharged. And so it's something that we've really been paying attention to with our workforce. And so I think that will it's going to certainly change the way that people want to live and work in the future. I think some of the other things that have been really kind of remarkable and probably unexpected is if you look at our sales effectiveness, working remotely has been highly effective. And so it's going to challenge some of the thinking that we've had in historically of, do you really need to actually to go on location and be in person, or are these roles that we can do more remotely in the future? And we were talking about that even with our board meetings are there certain meetings maybe we want to keep remote in the future, and that would become more attractive to new prospective board members. And so if you kind of go down this path of flexibility, it's really big and really important. And to our employees, they've always cared. The people that come to work here, one of our biggest cultural attributes is caring. You can see that in our cultural feedback. And so it's a very caring community. It's very connected to one another. And so I don't feel like the pandemic changed that. I think it's just kind of reemphasized it's part of who we are. And it's something that you do hear more about, though, through the course of this year, with the combination of, what's happening with the elections and what's happened, just with social change. And, that's created a little bit more of a hotbed requiring conversation. So one of the things that we have done that's been different, we've had speakers talking in the company. We've had a panel of employees with our Black employees that were talking about their experiences, both at WEX but outside of WEX. So I think that we have heard more desire to have conversation and more desire for people to be able to connect in a way that feels safe for them, but to, advance forward diversity, as a concept. And that's something we also hear from investors more than I would have in the past.
Yeah, it's also really interesting how so many organizations are using COVID as a kind of a springboard to challenge all sorts of other conventional workplace practices they might have. Like, do you need to do sales in person? Performance reviews, engagement surveys, does all that stuff need to be done the way that we're currently doing it? So I think the next year or so will be very interesting to see what other workplace practices really get challenged and put in the spotlight.
It's funny that those are things that we have toyed with. We actually did a beta test around removing performance evaluations, and we did that a few years ago, and we ended up putting them back in just because of the results that we got from. And we're like a big test and learn environment, so we've tested some of those things. Engagement surveys for us, we've gone to an in-house group of people that are developing that, so we can tailor it more specifically to our needs. As we've got kind of the data capability to do that. But I think that's fair. We're still learning what we want to know from those surveys, and I think we're getting smarter because of it.
What do you look for in a leader? So, let's say I worked at WEX Inc., and I was interested in getting promoted and moving up the ranks at the company. What do you look for when you decide if somebody's going to be a good leader or not?
So I look for, kind of the foundation part is, are they competent in what they do? So they have to, over deliver on expectations. And then on top of that, are they able to work collaboratively? Our whole value system and our compensation system has been set up over the years to reward people, not just for what they do, but how they do it. It's really embedded in our whole evaluation process. We have leadership behaviors at different levels in the organization of what we expect out of our employees. And so both of those elements matter: what you do, how you do it. Are you able to do it in a way that builds relationships and builds bridges across the organization? And then for me, I call it fire in the belly, but it's something that I don't like. I don't think you can undervalue ever. It's, I think other people would call it grit, but you can see it. It's when someone has, and even if it's a quiet thing or it could be more overt, but that quality matters a lot to me.
So I guess it's like the drive. My dad always says you got to have the drive.
Yeah, it's drive, it's passion.
Yeah.
It's kind of this. There's some people that can come to work and connect, and then there are other people that come to work and they connect on a whole different level because they care with their being, about the not just the company but how they're doing, and those people move you forward in leaps and bounds.
Yeah, no, totally agree. You talked about, I can't remember if this was in your TEDx talk or an article, but you said that there's a lot of importance in saying yes to opportunities. It might have been in that TEDx talk. Why is that so important? Because I feel like a lot of people are very good at saying no to things and not so good at saying yes to things. So can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's because I think about career progression as in part your capability, in part sponsorship, in part timing. And when you say yes to things, and when I say things, it's important things to the company, and they may not be in your direct role responsibility, but what that allows you to do is get exposure to other people that you wouldn't normally get. And it allows you to show a set of skills that are often different than those that are required in your job. And so I think it gives you the capability of being seen in a different way, which creates sponsorship for you. And so I think that, often, and I'll talk about my career, often what I was given for assignments that would be outside my job were things that weren't fun. They were, something was broken or something, was happening across, some other part of the planet. And I was being asked to step in and be involved. And I really think that doing that was a big part of my career progression, because it, again, allowed people to see me in a different light than they would have if I was just, the CFO or the controller or some of the things that I've done in my past.
So you took on the hard projects and maybe some projects that other people didn't want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that if I had said no, it blocked that opportunity to distinguish yourself.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. How do you deal with mistakes or failures? Can you think of maybe a mistake or failure that pops into mind, and how do you deal with it when something doesn't go well?
Well, I do think of them as learning opportunities, and so I don't. The word failure is such a big, ugly word. I like to think of the fact that we are constantly learning, we're constantly evolving, and we're going to get better. And I think you have to create an environment like that, because if people feel like they can't fail, to use your word, then they're going to be too safe. And so I think that in my career, some of the things that are harder are when they're people related. And, and I think they should be hard when you're making decisions that affect other people. They should be hard decisions. But what I've learned over time is that when you need to make a change with somebody, then, waiting doesn't make it better. And so, and I think about, things that I've learned from, it's largely been about doing things sooner rather than later. And, sometimes that is about people. Sometimes it's about, something that you need to do, but you just are worried about the cumulative impact of having too many balls in the air. And I think that, again, what I've taken away from that is when you have something you have to do, if it's hard, just do it as quickly as you can.
Yeah, don't put off the difficult things. Get them done first.
Yeah. I also tell people bad news doesn't age well. So if you got something that isn't good, just make sure that you want to get it out.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. Bad news doesn't age well. I'm gonna have to borrow that quote. Um, if you could go back in time and give advice to your younger self, what would you say?
I'd say it's almost always about the people that you have the power to impact the way others think and feel by your own actions. And so I think that sometimes when you're younger, or at least when I was, yeah, I would undervalue the impact of my words or my actions. And as I've gotten older, and you almost take away some of your power when you do that. When you get older, you realize that um, everything you do affects the people around you, and like it or not. And so you have to be, you have to just be thoughtful about that. And certainly for me, it was one of the big learnings I had when I became CEO. I remember walking down the hall the day that the announcement had gone out, and suddenly people looked at me differently. And these are people that I'd worked with for years, but suddenly the body language was different. And it's been probably one of the bigger learnings I've had as in this role, that it's not about me, it's about the seat of CEO, and that I have to be, really thoughtful about how I use that.
Yeah, that's I think great advice, especially for people in leadership positions, because sometimes we can forget. Maybe last one or two questions for you. What does personal success look like to you? Because I know that this is something a lot of people always think about is how do you know when you've made it? How do you know when you've become successful? So what does that look like to you?
I'm going to answer that, but I want to the other thing I would say in that last point is the idea that you might meet with somebody, and for you that meeting, may be the last thing that's on your mind, but it may be the most important meeting of the day for that other person. And so kind of, taking a deep breath and being the person you want to be in that moment is, I think, really important. And it's something particularly in this pandemic environment. You might be running 100 miles an hour and really thinking about a lot of things, but if you can just take a deep breath and reframe yourself for what
Yeah.
you're about to go into, I think that's really important. Um, and and when it relates to what I think is, what's going to give me value personally, um, Alan Mulally I had met, a couple of years ago, and one of the things he said is just like stuck with me like crazy. He said that the purpose of life is to love and be loved, in that order. And so when I think about my personal success, that I, think very highly about the health and happiness of my children, my husband, my mom, my family, and I think that's how I define personal success.
Putting things into perspective, focusing on the things that matter. I like that.
Yeah.
Uh, and maybe last question for you, and this is really just personal life or business lessons. So if there are some crucial either business or life lessons that you've gleaned over the course of your career and all your experiences, what would those be?
So life lessons, I don't know that I would have said that there's any one thing. I mean, clearly, my mom has had a huge influence over my life. So it's kind of the overarching thing, and what she's taught me is she's got this quiet strength to her that is really settling for me, and it's something I hope I emulate. And then the other thing I'd say is that when the most formative times in my career have been some of the hardest times, and I say that with when I first took over as CEO, so I became CEO at the end of 2013. We were in an environment where fuel prices were dropping, which was at that point a decent part of our revenue stream. And I was pregnant, and and I changed the structure of the company, and I changed the players in the company, and we really changed what we were investing in, and we found new sources of revenue. We really altered our M&A strategy. And we went from, we were about 700 million in 2013, and instead we were about 1.7 billion last year. But, that those first few years, and I would equate it to kind of this period of time, there are harder times, but you learn a lot about yourself, and you learn the importance of planting both feet and digging in and using your own fire in your belly when things are hard, and how much that matters to those around you, even more so when things are hard than it is when everything's easy.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice to end on. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. Where can people go to learn more about you or connect with you? Anything that you want to mention for people to check out?
So they can go to our website, wexinc.com, or they can go to my LinkedIn page under Melissa Smith, and love to hear from anybody.
Well, thank you again. I really appreciate it. These are, wonderful stories and experiences. So again, I really want to thank you for your time and for speaking with me.
Yeah, thank you. It's a total pleasure for doing this. Thanks, Jacob.
My pleasure. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, my guest has been Melissa Smith, the CEO of Wex Inc. And if you want to get access to more episodes, you can go to futureofworkpodcast.com, and I'll see all of you next time. Thanks again for tuning into the Future of Work with Jacob Morgan. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please remember to follow me on Spotify, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or your favorite platform at futureofworkpodcast.com. And also, don't forget to check out my brand new podcast on entrepreneurship with my wife, Blake, at byobpodcast.com. If you want to reach out to me about sponsoring the show, or if you just have feedback for me, please send me an email, jacob@thefutureorganization.com. And of course, I would love a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever your preferred channel is.